As a small prelude to this video, I have to say to you that I'm having trouble with my droopy eyelids, and I'm almost certainly going to have surgery now to fix this problem. So I apologise for the sort of sly appearance I have at times. I can't help it. It doesn't stop me carrying on with the work, and I just thought I'd mention that. So probably in the future I'll have a few videos with dark glasses on, because it's pretty bruising apparently when they do the surgery. Thank you for watching, and here we go.
Arctic polar bears are facing near extinction by the end of the century if the sea ice they depend on continues to disappear. That's the stark warning from a new study looking at the long-term future of the bears as greenhouse gas emissions contribute to the melting of the bears' frozen hunting grounds.
Well, hello. This one is GB News again. I'm back on GB News, but this time with a different opponent, as it were, whose name is Dominica, I can never say it, Dominica McCarthy. And it's spelt very funnily. And he is, I think, a member of Extinction Rebellion, Stop Oil and all of that. He's a leading advocate on the alarmist side. And I look forward to dealing with him. He is different to deal with than Jim Dale, because he at least, I think he's more intelligent, to put it bluntly. And so it doesn't stop the personal attacks, mind you, but we had an interesting session, and I will learn as I go how to deal with this. And what I'm going to do in this video is I'm going to dissect it as normal straight away, but afterwards I'm going to go into much more detail about the subject of the polar bears and the Arctic. So the subject was, the news that polar bears are starving in the Arctic and so on. The situation's terrible through ice loss and so on. So let's get started on this video and see how it goes.
Good afternoon. It's just fast approaching 22 minutes after 3 o'clock. This is GB News on TV, online and on digital radio. It's time now for Climate Control, where we unpick the debate around the climate. And today we're looking at the future of the polar bear. It's become the iconic animal that represents global warming. That's what scientists say. Scientists now say that the reduction of sea ice means that the giant bears risk starvation as they can't adapt to hunt on land. I'm joined by Donica McCarthy, climate columnist for The Independent, and climate scientist Paul Burgess. Right, Donica, I'm going to start with you then. So this sounds sad. Their habitat is melting. Is this right?
Absolutely. I mean, you're absolutely right. The polar bear is loved by children all over the world. It's an iconic species, something we all love.
Well, it'll poke your eyes out.
But
it'd eat you if it's...
Well, most children don't play with polar bears, in my childhood anyway. Well. We played with teddy bears. The problem, of course, is polar bears hunt on ice. They depend on seals for their food. And interesting enough, they hibernate during the summer when the ice melts.
Not too important, but just to put it right for people, polar bears do not hibernate at all. That's a myth. The female polar bear makes a den and gives birth to its young in the den, and it actually has to maintain normal body temperatures. In hibernation, you lower your heart rate, you lower your temperatures and survive. That's proper hibernation. Polar bears don't do that. They have to keep the heat going for the young. So in actual fact, polar bears do not hibernate as such, and the males, of course, don't need to make a den at all. So it's just to put that small point right, because there is a common myth that they hibernate, and they've adjusted not to hibernate so they can keep the heat going.
And then they hunt during the winter.
No, that's not really correct. They do, well, it's correct that they hunt in the winter, definitely. The truth is they hunt all year round. They try to eat all year round. They build up the huge body reserves in the winter where they're eating of seals and so on. But even in the summer, if you take the walruses, walrus situation where the polar bears have learned to drive walruses off cliffs, and so they don't even fight with them to eat huge amount, a couple of tons of blubber each time. So it isn't as simple as they say.
And because the ice is melting for longer, so instead of 100 days, 130 days in parts of the Arctic, they are actually beginning to suffer and not get enough food.
The actual report that we were studying there there that the paper behind the BBC story didn't do anything other than say, if the ice melts more, there's a problem. It didn't study any ice melting. It was a study over a period of 22 days on 20 polar bears in one place. And it had no bearing really on population. It had no bearing on other than studying how much, when these polar bears were on land without the ice, how much they degrade in terms of weight, on how much they degrade when they do 100 and 150 kilometre swims. So they were just a tiny little study. It wasn't really anything to do with the ice. And there is no evidence, by the way. What he's saying there is, it just in one place, the ice can melt, because he knows everywhere else it's really going very well, as it were. So just in one place. Well, you can get little bits of ice changing around the Arctic ice at any time. But, no real evidence here. But let's carry on.
This doesn't apply to all polar bears. There are different populations, for example, in the deep Arctic, where the ice melt hasn't yet reached. But in the medium to long term, the future doesn't look good for the polar bear.
But I read that the polar bear population has suddenly gone up exponentially. Yeah. Couldn't that be part of the reason why a lot of the ice are melting? There's too many of them.
They're sinking the ice.
Well, there's too many of them.
Yeah, what actually happened was that we did something positive. We listened to the environmentalists, and what they did is they stopped hunting them. They banned the hunt. And so the polar bear was going through the floor population during the 70s. And we agreed globally to actually put a ban on the hunt, and we saved them, and they started recovering. However, now we need to do the same again, listen to the environmentalists, tackle climate change, stop burning fossil fuels, and we'll stop the Arctic melting.
Just think of what he just said there. If we stop the burning of fossil fuels now, if we do that, then we'll stop the Arctic melting. That is such an absurd claim. First of all, we are now burning more fossil fuel today than ever in the history of humankind, because of China, India, the Far East, etc. So no matter what we do, it makes no difference anyway. But the idea that the only reason for the Arctic melting is fossil fuel. Before then, everything was fine, everything was great before we brought along mankind and fossil fuels, is absurd. The Arctic's always been in a cyclical pattern, not an identical cycle, as it were, but quite a complicated one, and I'll be showing that later. So this is an absurd claim. So he goes from they're now starving, yeah? And we'll just say about the numbers now soon, but they're now starving, and we've got to do straight to stopping fossil fuel. This is an absurdity. And of course, what we do makes no difference at all, and he can't possibly argue different to that.
Cull the polar bears as well.
Pardon?
You're saying cull the polar bears as well?
Cull the bears? No, protect them for future
generations. There's too many of them, isn't it? What do you think? Paul Burgess?
Well, this polar bear scare has been going for a long time, and it's not true. Polar bears now, the expert on this is Susan Crockford, if anyone wants to look up her report, and she puts the population now at about 32,000. And now it was down to about 10,000 in the 60s, and it's quite right, we stopped the shooting. But since the scares were started in the 90s, all these scares, the population's increased. And as regards less ice, actually, I'll pass this along to you, but we've got the highest ice now in December 22nd. That was the highest level for 14 years. We've now got the highest level for 21 years at this time.
Where did you get that information from?
This came, there's the link, and this comes from the USIC Centre. These are people who measure by satellites. It's the accepted thing, and I can give you the individual data as well.
I'm just curious as to where the information is coming from.
It's all coming from the official source, which no one can really argue with, where they measure it and publish it worldwide in America. And if you go to the site, it's the USIC Centre, and that's a fact.
.gov/.
That's right, .gov.
Well, listen, he's found some figures that say that the ice isn't actually melting, and
it's recovering.
The amount of ice goes up and down every year depending on the weather.
I am, of course, referring to trends, comparing them year to year. Here he's talking about, the fact it varies throughout the summer and winter. This is just diversion. He understands that I'm talking about trends, but this is just a meaningless thing. Obviously, it varies between the summer and the winter.
However, depending on the climate, we've lost 70% of the volume.
But they said this about the coral reefs. They said the coral reefs will be gone.
In the last 30 years, we've lost already 70% of volume of the summer ice, and we've lost 50% of the area covered by it. You can look up the NOAA, which is the US government website, it lists the figure. Yes, it goes up and down, as Paul rightly says, but if you look at a track, it's gone down by 70%. We've lost the volume.
That's not so. In actual fact, they start the records in 1979. The 1970s were the Ice Age coming scare. So they started the records at a very high level. Now, if you take the records prior to 1979, you'll see a cycle. So if you're going to if there's a cycle like this, and you're going to take just the downside, but that downside has gone like that, and then it's flattened out. Right, and even this report on polar bears, and I read the actual paper on this, and even they're not claiming that the ice is going. They're just saying if the ice goes. There's no study on that. The study that's behind this story...
That study is not about ice. It's about the polar bear population. So why would they be about...
No, it's about 20 polar bears in a tiny little area. So it's got no relevance to ice. Do you agree?
Exactly.
Oh, good. We both agree on that.
But you just said they didn't mention the ice, and you said that...
No, but I'm talking about the BBC and the way the BBC reported it. The way the BBC reported that was the ice is going, the polar bears are suffering. They're now at a population of about 32,000, according to Susan Crockford, who's the expert. You know, in Hudson Bay.
But the BBC was saying in that area in Hudson Bay, which is what I said,
yes.
In areas of there's 19 separate populations of polar bear, and some of those populations are in areas where the ice is gone or going, and those are the ones that they studied, and those are the ones that are beginning to starve.
No. There's actually, if you look at the Crockford report on this, you'll see the western Hudson Bay and the eastern Hudson Bay. Now, one of those decreased by 27% population. That's a fact. But the other side increased by 30%. Look, you can't deny the fact that we now have more polar bears than we started since we started recording.
I haven't denied it. I actually said the numbers have increased because we stopped.
And what you're basing everything on, then is the scare story about CO2.
No, I'm not talking about
You are, because you're saying we've got to take action.
I didn't. The factual fact, whether you believe in climate science or not,
I believe in climate science.
95% of the world believe in the climate. Whether you believe
that is not true.
Let me finish.
Yeah.
Whether you believe in climate science or not, we have lost 70% of the ice, and that means that is a threat.
Since when? Don't use statistics like that.
To the polar bear population.
Since when have we lost 70% of the ice? The reason I am trying to pin him down here is because I know the start date is 1979, but I need his end date, because if you're going to claim there's been a reduction between when and when, it's fundamental. And I also know, as I'll be showing you later, that, this is a total distortion of the facts. So that's what I was trying to pin him down to. But now I'm in the pinning to finish that pinning down of. He has to go for personal attacks.
We have lost 70 of the historical... 70, since the historical period, since the 70s.
Since when? 1979?
Since the 70s. You can
you're cherry-picking statistics.
No, I'm actually checking...
No, everyone can look it up. All the records start in 1979.
Well,
there they are.
You're recognised as an erratic...
there they are.
Eccentric on this issue.
Well, actual fact, what was happening there was I was laying a trap, effectively, because it's the whole idea. The actual peak ice for the last 100 and odd years, actually, well over 100 and odd years, was in 1979. It was the Ice Age coming scare time. So they've taken the very peak and ignored all the lows and things before that, which I'll be going into. So I was trying to get him to say when the start date and end dates were, because also the decline has also stopped. So he was cherry-picking the dates to get this data out. I found out where the story came from, and I'll be dealing with it later in the full analysis after this dissection. But here, now, having been trapped on this, or the starting of my trap, if you like, it's a trap to just expose the truth, but on the start of that, when I had to try to force him, he couldn't even name the date of which he was quoting the statistics from, he then reverted to a personal attack. He said, you are recognised an erratic eccentric on this. That is a personal attack. It's not dealing with the evidence and the graphs I'm giving. And actually, Extinction Rebellion are trained how to do this. They're trained how to, if they get stuck, go on and waste all the time on personal attacks. Now, I'm determined not to do personal attacks on him. He doesn't in any way distort or exaggerate his qualifications for this. He doesn't. He's a journalist for The Independent, and I think The Guardian he writes for, and other things. He's appeared on BBC documentaries in depth, and so on. So he is what he is. I've got no problem with that at all. And I am not going to do personal attacks. The only reason I did that on Jim Dale, the only reason, was because after continual personal attacks on me, which I ignored, after continual ones on that, he actually had a go at everybody. He actually said a whole pile of people voting for reform, for example, and I wasn't even advocating reform, but he had to bring it in. A whole pile of people, the millions of people, they're sort of low educational, and it was a bit cheeky coming from his own background. So I decided to take him out on that, to actually expose the truth on this, because he was not what he appears to be. This gentleman is what he appears to be, and it makes life much easier for me. Also, he's done something really important here, which Jim Dale never did. He just refuted everything I gave him. He accepted the 32,000 figure. He accepted the population's grown. So in his world now, and this is his problem, and it's called polar bear denial, in his world, we've gone from 10,000 and up. And all this time, the ice has been disappearing, etc. In this world, the population has boomed. So there's something different here. He can't explain that. So he just wants to swap straight away to this, get rid of fossil fuels, which he didn't give any justification for. Having then been caught, he now reverts to personal attack. I was expecting it. I hoped I wouldn't be getting it, because what it does is it now wastes time. It wastes time on the discussion, taken away from the evidence and the trap I was setting. So it just leaves me to put all this right in videos like this. That's what I'm trying to do. Okay, back to the video.
The vast majority of the mainstream scientists understand...
That's an assertion. That's an assertion, appeal to authority.
That's not fair to say that he's recognised as an erratic.
It is.
That's not fair.
No, if you have to look at climate science, you have to look at the legitimate science. And Paul is outside that mainstream.
No, I'm not.
No, hold on. Sorry. Sorry. It's not fair, though, to label people just because you think other people might recognise or label him that way. I don't recognise him that way. I see him as putting forward a different perspective, and I think it's a valid perspective that should, and I think the other perspective should always be challenged.
I think you're fair to call it a person, I think, but the science that he's referring to is erratic and is outside the mainstream.
That is not correct, actually. But never mind. That's an appeal to authority. You can argue about your God, and I can argue about my God. That gets us nowhere. This is the Atlantic multi-decadal oscillation. This is taken from the Met Office, by the way, right? And this shows you the warm period in the Atlantic that lasts for about 30 years. We're coming to an end of this now. This period of warming, it goes to cooling. This period of warming started in 1995. We've had 29 years of this warming. That's what melts ice. It isn't the temperature that melts the ice, it's the water temperature. It's the water temperature.
Well, when somebody says it isn't the temperature that melts water,
no, I said it's the water temperature that melts the ice.
We're not talking about real science, we're talking about eccentric science.
I'm sorry. That's ridiculous. I mean, if the water's warm underneath the ice...
Temperature has nothing to do with...
No, I didn't say that. You're misquoting me. I said the water temperature controls the ice melt, not the air temperature.
Well, listen,
don't misquote me.
OK, so fair enough. But the bottom line is, it's good to dissect the story.
Correct.
Tell us something about the polar bears. I want to hear the full story. So I've got to say thank you so much to Paul Burgess, climate scientist, and also Donica McCarthy, who's a climate columnist in the Independent. I could get there in the end. Take your teeth out, put them back in. This is GB News on TV, online, and on digital radio. I'm Nana Akua.
A good website to visit is Oceanus here, and it's actually got some good advice in it, some good explanations, and I'm going to do a series of quotes from it. The first quote: the Arctic region, however, and it's comparing it to the Antarctic, is mostly ocean surrounded by land, and the ocean plays a big role in keeping the Arctic relatively warm. The Arctic similarly accumulates ice, and they're comparing to the Antarctic there, but rather than thick ice sheets, the Arctic Ocean has only a thin layer of sea ice that sits atop a relatively warm ocean. It's that ocean water that keeps the Arctic so much warmer than the Antarctic. Although there may be a layer of ice between the ocean and the atmosphere, It's just 1 to 3 meters, well that's 3 to 10 foot thick. As air temperatures drop, they freeze some of the ocean, which causes the ice to grow thicker. But there are limits to the thickness of Arctic ice due to the ocean's ability to hold heat. A cold atmosphere will only freeze a very small amount of water at the ocean's surface. And ice that freezes in winter often melts during the summer. Wind and wave action also cause the sea ice to shift, which can lead to breaks in the ice, and as the ice breaks, sunlight can directly warm the ocean beneath and melt the sea ice from below. And it's the sea ice melting from below that is the biggest factor. So in summary there, yes, the air temperature in effect creates the ice, but it is battling with the warm ocean, and it's the warm ocean that controls it and subsequently does the majority of the melting, just like with an iceberg that is 9/10 below the surface, and it's the water that melts the iceberg far faster than the top. Don't forget, ice has a very high reflection, an albedo, very high reflection back of the shortwave radiation coming in from the sun. It bounces a lot of it back, whereas water is the exact opposite. It really absorbs most of it. So but currents, like having the temperature of the water a half degree C warmer because of, let's say, the multi-decadal oscillation we're talking about, has a big effect. It's going to have a big effect now we're going into the cooling with that multi-decadal oscillation. That's the Atlantic multi-decadal oscillation. So it is not as simple as the saying, like it gets colder. So the other thing is there, he was saying that, parts of the Arctic are this, they're starving in parts. Well, the bears can swim for days. They can swim at 10 kilometers an hour, and they can swim for hundreds of miles and hundreds of kilometers. So they do migrate and move and so on. And the study that sparked this debate today was one revealed by the BBC, and it's a study that simply spent 22 days studying 20 bears in a part which wasn't frozen, and they were just living off what they could scavenge, as it were. They weren't dying, and they go through a natural cycle, the polar bears, taking on enormous quantities of fat to look after. Now, the other factor we've got to take into account is the fact that water absorbs the radiation from the sun. And don't forget, in the summer, you've got it all the time, you've got no night. But the water that absorbs the radiation from the sun actually creates plankton. And the growth of plankton, etc., really fuels huge blooms of it, and it fuels the whole fish population, the whole ecocycle, as it were, and you get much more food, and therefore the seal pups have a much better chance of surviving. So seal populations grow. So every time you don't have ice covering the ocean, you have the energy going into the ocean, you get more food. So it isn't as simple as less ice and so on. But the basic situation here that McCarthy was trying to defend is this. We now have a huge growth in the polar bear population, which he doesn't deny. But at the same time, he's saying we've had all this ice loss. So if you're going to apply any logic to that, it would seem more ice loss equals bigger population of polar bears. I mean, there's no case here to answer. What it is they've got to keep each alarmist thing going, regardless of the evidence. The polar bears are thriving. Yes, there's all sorts of movement. And I put the Susan Crockford link for that report in if you want to read all about this, not just polar bears, but the whole ecology really of the Arctic. Then she's fantastic. And you'll find that the scientists there, whose livelihoods depend on keeping the alarm going, they're saying there's 26,000 seals because they're actually doing the lowest possible they can get away with to keep the alarm going. There's an awful lot of vested interest here in science, because people would not have jobs if there wasn't the alarm, because the politicians wouldn't vote the money to it. It's a self-perpetuating system. Now, the other factor I'm going to go into now is to study the Arctic ice. And in studying that, I'm going to use the history of it. And I'm going to go, first of all, into the long-term history of Arctic ice. This paper from Stein, dated 2017, looks at the Holocene. The Holocene is the period since the last ice age, as it were, the last glacial period to be more exact. And it's the warm period that were between the glaciation periods, normally lasting 10 or 15,000 years, but we're in about 10,000-ish years, 11,000 years now. And it goes back 10,000 years. So starting here in the present, we go to the past, and you can see that in the past, the sea ice extent in the Arctic was much less than it is today. So, and also look at the variations you get, incredible variations in Arctic sea cover. It's totally normal. And of course, it's worth noting, after diverging from brown bears, because that's who they came from, about 500,000 years ago, polar bears evolved into highly specialized hunters of marine mammals on the Arctic sea ice. And here we are with another work. This is again from a paper from 2017 here. And here you can see, oh dear, you can see the medieval warm period, the Roman warm period, when we had much lower ice, and the Roman warm period was much lower. So, but then again, these periods didn't exist according to the alarmists, did they? This paper used the Akua database from the British Met Office to put the 1920 to 2016 Arctic temperatures. And as you can see, there's no significant change between that period and that period. In this shot, we compare the 1995 sea ice extent, that's the summer sea ice extent, with the July 2022 summer sea ice extent, both on the same date. And you can see that the 2022 is slightly less than the 1995, well within the normal sort of variation. This is what's going to happen all the time, always has happened. This chart is based at the 80th parallel, and it shows the 2022 temperatures throughout the single year, and it's plotted in days from zero, how many days into that year, on the x-axis there. So the water temperature, in the case of salt water, when it freezes, is not 0 degrees, it's minus 1.8 degrees. So here is a line for the freezing point of the salt water, and it shows you the times that the temperature, the air temperature, is above the freezing point of the salt water for 2022, and it shows you the time it has to do the melting. And of course, the melting opportunity, given that it's ice and the reflectivity of the ice, is quite small. This is the headline story, of course, from the mainstream media about this 50% since first satellite records began. This is what Mr. McCarthy was basing this on. And it doesn't give times, it's pretty meaningless, but it's not really a scientific way of expressing it. And what we're going to do now is look at that data since 1979 and just before. So we're now going to go to much more current data on the ice to see what the real situation is in fact. This is starting in 1979 and is when they consider it to be the start of the satellite records for the Arctic ice extent. And this is the minimum area. This is not the average or the top, it's the minimum area it gets to in the summer. And we're starting here in 1979. Let's see how it goes. So what I see here is it actually went up after 1979 there. Just gone 1980, and it pretty well stayed level until about 1995. You could get maybe a slight decline from about 1990, but then it fell. It fell from about 1995 down to about 2007 or so, when it pretty well leveled out. And we'll look at that in more detail now, but that's what I'm seeing there. What I am not seeing is a straight decline. It's by ignoring this leveling out that the alarmists get their 50%. They're not interested in the truth, they're only interested in alarm. Now this graph here shows the minimum sea ice extent since 2006, and you can see there is no trend at all. We have truly levelled out in terms of minimum sea ice since 2006. What's now interesting to me is that as we're coming out of this Atlantic warm phase in the multi-decadal oscillation and entering the cool phase, will we see the minimum sea ice growing again? Well, as we're all supposed to understand, we've just ended up with the hottest year ever on record. Ever. Even 125,000 years apparently. So it's funny, isn't it, that with the hottest year on record, as you can see here, the actual extent of the sea ice, and this is in January this year, is higher than it's been for about 20 years. Now, just going back before 1979, this record is from 1920 to 1975 from the Department of Energy, one of the forerunners of the current things like NOAA, and it shows the ice extent going back to 1920. By the way, the gap between 1975 and 79, when the satellites started, were actually covered by satellites, but for some reason they don't like putting them on record. Nevertheless, what this shows is a cyclical nature of the ice. But I can tell you that the 1979 level was higher than any of those levels there. So the 1979 level was really the highest probably in the entire 10,000 year Holocene, because the past in the Holocene has pretty well always been warmer, cyclical as I've shown you, but warmer. And this shows the cyclical nature of our sea ice. This was done by observation at that time, and it just shows the ridiculous nature of just taking a short section from 1979, which is what the alarmists do. Now, I'm just going to end up with some examples of the sort of rubbish alarmism that the public are being fed. And I have made a video on this particular next section before, but because I've got so many new subscribers, etc., it may be worth going through this story again. It's a CNN story from America, and it's about a single starving polar bear. So I'll just dissect it as we go through, because it stretches credibility, this one. It gets me so angry that they're treating the public as if they're idiots, and people don't think for a second to look through the falsehood. But here it is completely obvious. So let's go with this CNN broadcast.
Scientists have been warning us about climate change for years. And the world certainly took notice a couple of weeks ago when a video of a starving, disoriented polar bear made its way around the planet on social media. Our guest has witnessed that changing level of Arctic sea ice and what it's doing to people and to animals. Paul Nicklin is a photographer, a marine biologist and co-founder of Sea Legacy. He's documented what a warming climate is doing for wildlife. You're joining me from Nanoose Bay on Vancouver Island in Canada. You took those images of that starving polar bear. Tell us about it. What did you see? What struck you?
Anyways, we were working in an area up in Baffin Island, northern Baffin Island, celebrating a potential creation of a marine protected area. And we were seeing some bears, healthy bears, fat bears, normal bears.
Just to clarify that, they're making a documentary. They're there, they're seeing all the normal bears, fat bears, healthy bears, everything's fine. Then what happens?
And we came around a corner into a bay with our boat, and we noticed this lump of white fur on the ground, and we didn't know if it was a dead bear or what it was. So we went on land, we positioned ourselves a long ways away, and the head moved, and we realized it was a very, a polar bear that was in trouble. And our team had just positioned ourselves, and slowly after maybe an hour, the bear very slowly got up, and that's that gut-wrenching moment where you see where he's laboring to get up and dragging himself across the tundra, and we didn't, obviously know what to do at that moment other than film.
Well, so there we are. All the rest of the bears were healthy. Everyone, they were making a nice nature documentary, and they found a dying bear. Wow! Bears actually have a lifespan, and they die. But no, climate, this went right round the world, by the way. This became a huge story. The starving polar bear because of climate change. So climate change now is very selective. It just picks on individual bears. The rest are all healthy and doing great, but no, climate change picked on this one. What a stupid story. But look at the alarm it created around the world. No science there at all. Pure alarmism. Ridiculous. So I now turn to the man, Al Gore, who's made huge sums of money out of carbon trading and so on, setting up overseas trusts and overseas businesses to, people to contribute to offset their carbon, etc. A very, very wealthy man. A lot more wealthy since he started discussing climate change. And here he is making a serious prediction based on science. Let's listen.
Another new study to be presented by U.S. Navy researchers later this week warns it could happen in as little as 7 years. 7 years from now. In the last few months, it has been harder and harder to misinterpret the signs that our world is spinning out of kilter.
And now for this 2016 ice free in the summer prediction.
You have sea ice, which is melting at a rate that the Arctic Ocean now increasingly is exposed. In 5 years, scientists predict we will have the first ice-free Arctic summer. That exposes more ocean to sunlight. Ocean is dark. It consumes more of the heat from the sunlight, which then accelerates the rate of the melting and warming rather than the ice sheet and the snow that used to reflect it back up into the atmosphere.
Well, so let's give Al Gore a second chance. 2 years later, from the previous announcement, now in 2009, he moves the date on. He moves the date on of the end of the Arctic ice in the summer by 2 years.
It's hard to capture the astonishment that the experts in the science of ice felt when they saw this minimum in 2005, which meant that the amount of ice that had melted, it's been roughly the size of the continental United States, minus an area roughly the size of Arizona. Nothing against Arizona. But the amount that melted in 2005 was equivalent to an area covering everything east of the Mississippi River in the United States. Then, when the real shock to the scientists came was in 2007, when this happened. Their phrase was, it fell off a cliff. And then the extra amount that melted was this much. Now, this covers the area of ice. It does not cover the volume of the ice, and Bob Carell referred to this. The U.S. Naval Postgraduate School has a team that integrates the U.S. Navy's nuclear submarines that go under the ice cap and satellite measurements that are calibrated to work with it. And based on that, they said actually 2008 had a smaller minimum, probably, than 2007. And these are figures that are fresh. I don't know if they've been, I don't know when they were released, but I just got them yesterday from Dr. Václav Maslowski at the Naval Postgraduate School, and this is the volumetric record of the ice.
Well, shiver my timbers. I happen to have right up-to-date information on this volume business. The volume is the extent of the ice and the depth of it. And don't forget the depth of ice is very much governed by the water temperature. Nevertheless, here's the graph. And so pretty well level until about 1995-ish, around about there, and then quite a steep, nice drop there until about 2010 when it levels out again. So in terms of volume, pretty well reflecting towards something like the multi-decadal oscillation. And don't forget, besides the Atlantic multi-decadal, I can never say it, there's also a Pacific one, and that also comes in via Alaska, as it were, to the Arctic. So I don't know the relationship between those and Arctic sea ice, but there must be some relationship to have those oceans warming up and cooling down on a 30-year basis. So there we are, up-to-date information for Al Gore and his doom predictions, and we'll return back to Al Gore.
And some of the models suggest to Dr. Maslowski that there is a 75% chance that the entire North Polar ice cap during some of the summer months could be completely ice-free within the next 5 to 7 years.
Well, for those of you who made it to the end of this video, thank you for watching. I know it's been a long one. I just had to get it out of my system. I've tried to provide lots of information there and give you a background, besides the dissection at the beginning. But I'd like to leave this video with a tribute, really, to a man I greatly respect. His name is Mark Stein, and I'm going to leave you with him, because he's also experienced, like me, people claiming to be maybe what they're not. Thank you for watching.
Out over bad, and only a very weak idea demands that it must be protected from any criticism. Professor Ivor Javer, the Nobel Prize winner. By the way, when I say he's a Nobel Prize winner, I mean he's a real one. He won the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1973, not a fraudulent Nobel Prize winner, unfortunately, large members of Rear Admiral Titley's faculty, Michael Mann, Richard Alley, William Easterling, all of whom have falsely claimed to be Nobel Prize winners on an industrial scale, as have many other climate scientists. There's never been a misrepresentation of credentials on this scale. It used to be a very serious business, but apparently it's not when your cause is, quote, saving the planet. But it is a revealing. It is this misrepresentation of credentials by people falsely claiming to be Nobel laureates is revealing, because it gets to the heart of the problem here, that they are attempting to cloak the science in an authority that it does not, in fact, possess.